Imagine this. You wake up tomorrow, and everything feels almost right. The sun rises like it always does. The coffee is hot. The world outside your window continues in its usual rhythm. Nothing is wrong, but something inside you whispers that something isn't right either. There's no chaos, no breakdown, no obvious disaster. And yet, a strange tightness lingers in your chest. A dull emptiness sits behind your smile. You scroll through your day like you scroll through your phone quickly, aimlessly, passively. Nothing moves you. You try to focus. You try to be grateful. You try to make it all make sense. But deep down, there's an annoying feeling you can't shake. You're stuck, and you have no idea why. Not because life is unbearable, but because it's barely anything at all. Not because you failed, but because you've succeeded at things that don't mean anything anymore. Not because you're broken, but because you're exhausted from pretending you're whole. And here's the terrifying part. You've done everything right. You've read the books. You've meditated. You've set your goals. You've made your vision boards. You've journaled. You've visualized. You've manifested. You've done the inner work. Or at least, you thought you did. So why does it still feel like something's holding you back? Why does the life you've built still feel like someone else's? Why, after all your healing, do you still flinch when silence arrives? Why do you keep circling the same emotional patterns, disguised in new people, new jobs, new dreams? Carl Jung said, "We cannot change anything until we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses." What if the very thing you're doing to fix yourself is what's keeping you stuck? What if the endless striving, the constant analyzing, the spiritual performance, the obsession with becoming is the trap? What if your growth is just your ego learning how to look enlightened? You see, there's a paradox at the heart of modern self-development. We think healing is something we must achieve. We think becoming whole means constantly correcting what feels wrong. We confuse movement with transformation, activity with depth, change with evolution. But what if the real reason you feel stuck is because you're still trying to escape yourself? Not consciously, not out of malice, but because no one ever taught you how to sit with the parts of you that don't to look good on a vision board. No one ever said, you don't need to change, just stop running. Because when you stop, everything you've been avoiding starts to speak. And that's when it gets uncomfortable. That's when the ego panics. That's when the noise in your mind gets louder. Because silence is dangerous to everything that's false. Jung didn't teach us to strive toward perfection. He warned us, the more we repress, the more we split, the more we chase light, the more shadow we create. The more we try to fix the unacceptable parts of ourselves, the more power we give them. So the real question is not, how do I get unstuck? The real question is, what am I doing that's keeping me stuck? And even deeper, what part of me is terrified of being still enough to feel the truth? Because until you answer that, you'll stay stuck in the loop. You'll confuse insight with embodiment. You'll decorate your cage and call it freedom. But there is a way out. And it's not what you think. It doesn't come from doing more. It comes from stopping the one thing you've been doing your whole life without even realizing it. We're going there next. And once you see it, you won't unsee it. You were taught that to fix your life, you must do something. Set goals. Take action. Reframe your thoughts. Master your emotions. Push forward. But no one ever taught you how to stop doing, how to let things fall apart, how to sit in the stillness without rushing in to rearrange the pieces. Because in a world that worships control, silence is dangerous. Stillness is rebellion. And here lies the hidden problem, the root of your stuckness. You are still trying to control your transformation. Not obviously, not with force, but with subtle manipulation of your inner world. You try to heal your emotions like they're intrusions to be eliminated. You analyze your triggers as if they're mistakes to be surgically removed. You seek clarity not for understanding, but for relief from discomfort. You are still trying to escape being human by becoming better. But Carl Jung's work pointed in the opposite direction. He didn't promise relief through control. He invited surrender to what already is. He understood that transformation doesn't happen by force, but through integration. And integration requires radical acceptance, not resistance wrapped in spiritual language. When Jung spoke of individuation, the process of becoming your true self, he didn't describe it as a clean, linear journey. He described it as a confrontation with everything you've disowned, rejected, or hidden. He warned us, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And that unconscious part of you? It doesn't respond to control. It doesn't care how many affirmations you chant or how many morning routines you follow. It responds only to one thing, your willingness to face it without agenda. That's where most people remain stuck, not because they're lazy, not because they're broken, but because they are still performing healing instead of embodying wholeness. The ego is a brilliant actor. It can wear any mask, including the mask of a spiritual seeker. You meditate, but you're really trying to escape your mind. You journal, but only to organize your pain into something logical. You read Jung or Nietzsche or Frankl, not to dissolve your illusions, but to decorate them with philosophy. You're stuck because you're doing all the right things, with the wrong energy, the energy of fixing, of rejection, of fear masquerading as self-improvement. Arthur Schopenhauer once wrote, "We forfeit 3/4 of ourselves in order to be like other people." But you forfeited your depth trying to be acceptable to your own idea of who you think you should be. And here's the painful paradox. The more you try to become someone new, the more you reinforce the idea that who you are now is not enough. And that belief that you are fundamentally wrong is the prison you're trying to escape. But you can't escape a prison you're still guarding. Carl Jung didn't ask you to kill the ego. He asked you to see through it, to recognize that the ego is a partial self, a mask worn for survival, not a compass for truth. And if the ego can't dominate the healing process, it will imitate it. You'll start doing shadow work, not to meet your shadow, but to conquer it. You'll seek purpose, not to live more fully, but to escape the discomfort of not knowing. You'll chase signs, synchronicities, breakthroughs, anything that feels like progress. But real progress is often invisible. It's the softening of your judgments, the quiet acceptance of your contradictions, the moment you sit with sadness without dissecting it. You don't need another book, another breakthrough, or another 5-step plan. You need to stop doing the thing that's keeping you trapped in the illusion of progress, performing healing as a way to avoid the parts of yourself you still secretly judge. Because underneath all your routines and rituals, your soul doesn't want to be fixed. It wants to be seen, held, heard, allowed. It wants you to stop asking it to justify its existence. It wants you to stop bargaining for self-worth through performance. It wants you to stop avoiding the stillness where the real you begins to surface. The part that doesn't need to achieve anything. The part that doesn't need to prove it's healed. The part that is whole not because of what it's done, but because of what it's finally allowed to feel. Jean-Paul Sartre said, "Freedom is what you do with what's been done to you." But what if freedom starts with not doing? What if the greatest act of freedom is to stop managing your inner world like a to-do list and start relating to it as a sacred mystery? Because you're not a project. You're not a brand. You're not here to be optimized. You are here to remember, to feel, to become human again. And that begins when you stop. But if that's true, then what happens to the parts of you still clinging to effort, control, and performance? What happens when you stop trying to be whole and just are? That's where we're going next. because the consequences of avoiding this truth go deeper than you think. The most dangerous traps are not the ones that look like cages. They're the ones that look like progress. Imagine this. You've done everything to change your life. You've cleaned up your habits, created structure, read the right books, eliminated toxic people, maybe even left your job or your relationship. On the surface, everything seems healthier, smarter, even more spiritual. But underneath it all, something still doesn't move. Some part of you still feels like it's pressing its hands against glass, like it's watching your life instead of living it. And the more aligned you try to become, the more your life feels like a performance. This is the unseen consequence. You've mistaken control for healing. You've replaced chaos with calculation. You've silenced your instincts in the name of discipline. You've buried your wildness beneath structure and called it growth. And the result? You are no longer in crisis, but you are not free. You are functioning, but you are not feeling. You are surviving, but you are not becoming. Carl Jung warned us. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And that's exactly what this trap is. A beautiful, socially approved avoidance of the soul. You tell yourself, if I stay consistent, I'll finally feel worthy. If I let go of my anger, I'll be lovable. If I'm positive enough, calm enough, focused enough, I'll finally be at peace. But peace doesn't come from micromanaging your inner life. It comes from integration. And integration requires one thing most of us are terrified to give: radical honesty. Honesty that says, I don't want to be productive today, and that doesn't make me lazy. I'm still angry, and maybe that's valid. I don't feel spiritual right now, and I won't pretend to. Because the more you deny your emotions to fit your ideal self-image, the more you fragment. And fragmentation is the real reason you feel stuck. You've exiled parts of you that were once alive. Your rage, your grief, your desire, your darkness. All traded in for a sense of safety that no longer satisfies you. And the culture we live in rewards this. It teaches you that if you're not improving, you're failing. That if you're not positive, you're toxic. That if you're not calm, you're unstable. So you put your shadow in a box, label it healed, and smile on cue. But that box is heavy, and it follows you. It shows up in your relationships where you feel disconnected, even when you're doing everything right. It shows up in your work where you feel unfulfilled, even when you're successful. It shows up in your body through anxiety, fatigue, chronic tension, and mysterious symptoms that can't be explained. You've done everything to evolve, but your nervous system knows the truth. Your soul knows the truth. You're not free. You're just well behaved. And that obedience comes at a cost. Aldous Huxley once wrote, "The real hopeless victims of mental illness are to be found among those who appear to be most normal." It's the quiet ones, the composed ones, the ones who look fine, because looking fine is easier than feeling real. But the price of that illusion is steep. You lose access to your vitality. You numb not only your pain, but your joy. You become so accustomed to control that spontaneity feels threatening. And eventually, something in you begins to die. Not all at once, slowly, quietly. Your laughter becomes more polite. Your dreams shrink to fit your schedule. Your relationships revolve around performance, not presence. You wake up one day and realize you don't feel anything deeply anymore. Not sadness, not ecstasy, not truth. Just a low, persistent hum of safety that you mistake for peace. But peace without passion is just numbness with better branding. And this is what Jung meant when he said, neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. The real you, the unedited, messy, contradictory, alive you is buried beneath layers of spiritual bypassing, emotional censorship, and compulsive self-regulation. And here's the cruel irony. The very thing you're doing to feel more whole is what's keeping you divided. But this division doesn't scream. It whispers. It shows up in quiet moments. In the pause between distractions. In the mirror when no one else is around. In the way your body tightens when silence arrives. And unless you recognize it, you will keep mistaking your cage for clarity. You'll keep repeating cycles in more conscious ways. You'll keep trying to escape the discomfort by doing more, learning more, fixing more, until one day your soul stops whispering. And you realize you don't know who you are without your struggle. But there is another way, not one that asks you to achieve more, not one that asks you to try harder, but one that asks you to see through the very thing you've been relying on to feel safe. And it begins with a single radical question. What if you stopped trying to evolve and started allowing yourself to exist? That's the beginning of the rebellion. And it changes everything. Freedom doesn't begin with a breakthrough. It begins with a rebellion. Not loud, not traumatic, not a fight with the world, but a quiet, steady revolt against everything inside you that says, you're only worthy when you're improving. This rebellion doesn't look like revolution. It looks like rest. It doesn't feel like fire. It feels like stillness. It begins the moment you stop fixing yourself like a broken machine and start witnessing yourself like a living soul. That is the path Carl Jung walked toward. Not the path of self-perfection, but the path of self-integration. Where the ego doesn't get destroyed, it gets humbled. Where the darkness doesn't get erased, it gets embraced. The real transformation begins when you understand this truth. You are not here to become someone else. You are here to remember who you were before you learned to hide. But that remembering requires something difficult. It requires you to stop doing the one thing you've done your entire life to survive. Avoid your own presence. And this is where the rebellion gets real. You stop forcing clarity and let confusion speak. You stop chasing peace and let conflict surface. You stop performing light and allow your shadow to rise. Most people think the way out of suffering is through more answers, more frameworks, more doing. But the ones who actually transform, the ones who truly embody freedom, do something far more terrifying. They sit with what is. They sit with the anger without trying to cleanse it. They sit with the fear without trying to reframe it. They sit with the shame without trying to deny it. And in that sitting in that radical permission, something strange happens. The parts of you you thought were enemies become allies. The grief becomes grounding. The rage becomes clarity. The confusion becomes creative energy. Because everything you were taught to suppress is not your enemy. It's your raw material. This is what Jung meant by shadow work. Not a task, but a way of relating to what's been banished. Not to conquer it, but to welcome it home. But this is not passive. This is not spiritual laziness. This is a fierce kind of stillness that takes immense courage. Because when you stop doing, you lose your distractions. And when the distractions fall away, you're left with the one thing most people spend their whole lives avoiding, your truth. And truth doesn't always feel good. It might tell you that the life you've built doesn't fit you anymore, that the relationship you cling to is draining your soul, that the goals you chase are rooted in fear, not desire, that your identity, your achievements, your image, your routines is just a very polished mask. But this truth is the doorway. Because once you let it in, you can finally stop rearranging your prison and start walking toward freedom. The rebellion begins in moments like these, when you cancel a commitment, not out of flakiness, but because you're finally listening to your nervous system. When you say, I don't know, instead of pretending you have it together. When you cry and don't apologize for it. When you stop trying to explain your healing to people who don't understand it. When you create space, not to be productive, but to become visible to yourself. Friedrich Nietzsche said, One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. That chaos? It's not a flaw. It's the wool of your becoming. But to reclaim it, you must break the rules of the system you've internalized. It says you must be calm to be wise. It says you must be productive to be valuable. That says you must be healed to be lovable. Because real rebellion is refusing to betray your soul just to meet the expectations of your ego. It's saying, I will no longer participate in my own suppression. Not just socially, psychologically, spiritually. You stop editing your emotions to be palatable. You stop performing your identity to feel safe. You stop trying to look awakened and just start being real. And from this realness, something radical emerges. Self-trust. Not the kind that comes from routines and checklists. The kind that comes from facing your whole self and not flinching. The kind that says, even in my mess, I am still here. And I am still worthy. Because freedom isn't about feeling good all the time. It's about feeling everything and knowing you can hold it. That is the revolution. And it doesn't require one more step forward. It requires one step inward. But once you take it, once you stop doing what's kept you stuck for so long, everything begins to change. Not because you forced it, but because you finally got out of your own way. Now the question becomes, what is the final truth at the center of all this? What is the deepest realization that makes everything else fall into place? Let's go there. Imagine standing completely still, no running, no reaching, no reshaping. Just still. There's no plan in your mind. No affirmation to hold on to. No identity to protect. Only the raw hum of your own existence. At first, it's terrifying. Then, it's quiet. And then, something begins to move not from you, but through you. This is the moment when the final truth reveals itself. Not in words, not in logic, but in a sudden, undeniable knowing. You are never broken. You are never behind. You are never stuck. You are only convinced that your wholeness had to be earned. Carl Jung didn't ask us to become more. He asked us to become aware, to remember that the parts we fight are the ones we most need, that the self we seek is already within us, but it's been buried beneath years of conditioning, survival, and performance. All this time, you thought you were stuck because you weren't healing fast enough, or manifesting correctly, or doing enough shadow work. But the real reason is simpler and far more radical. You've been trying to improve something that was never broken. The unconscious doesn't care about your productivity acts or your polished self-image. It doesn't respond to force. It responds to truth. And the truth is this. What you call stuck is often your soul saying, I will not move until you meet me here, without judgment, without escape, without fixing. Because evolution is not linear. It's not clean. It's not a ladder. It's a spiral. A descent before ascent. A death before rebirth. Carl Jung taught that the path to individuation, the realization of the true self, requires going through the darkness, not around it. You can't spiritually bypass your shadow. You can't journal your way out of grief. You can't meditate your way past your shame. You must let it all live within you and stop fighting it. Viktor Frankl once said, when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. But what if changing yourself isn't about transformation in the way we've been taught? What if it means stripping away everything you were told you needed to be? What if real transformation is the return to what's been there all along? Here's the final truth. You become free the moment you stop treating your inner life like a problem to solve. You become whole, not through effort, but through allowance. Not through success, but through surrender. Not through doing, but through being. This is the paradox Jung understood so well. That freedom is not found in escape, but in embodiment. That true healing isn't an achievement. It's an unveiling. That the parts of you that scare you most are the doorway to your soul. So you stop chasing peak experiences. You stop worshiping clarity. You stop using growth as a weapon against your own complexity. And instead, you begin to trust the anxiety that rises when you try to be still, the discomfort that emerges when you stop performing, the boredom that comes when you're no longer numbing yourself with effort. These are not obstacles. They are invitations. Invitations to return home, to rest, to remember. Because nothing is more powerful than a person who is no longer at war with themselves. Nothing is more magnetic than someone who has allowed their chaos to become their compass. Nothing is more healing than the presence of someone who has stopped trying to be enough and simply is. So you sit, not to escape, not to fix, but to witness. You feel, not to process faster, but to be honest with yourself, maybe for the first time. You allow, even when it's messy, even when it doesn't feel high vibe, even when it's not pretty. And in that space, in that stillness where you stopped doing and started being, you realize something extraordinary. You were never stuck. You were just holding your breath, waiting for permission to return to yourself. Well, here it is. You have permission to rest, to release, to stop. And as you stop, something profound begins. Life moves again, but this time it's not dragging you. You're walking with it, not because you've mastered anything, but because you've remembered that being human was never the problem. The only problem was forgetting you already belonged to yourself. Now you remember. When you stop fighting the truth of who you are, life no longer resists you. It rises to meet you. If this spoke to something deep in you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Your inner work deserves support, not silence.